Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm excited to have you and I'm glad that you came back. Thanks so much. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the biggest figures in Mafia history. You don't really get much higher up than this guy, and I'm excited to tell you everything I know, and hopefully you'll be just as interested as I am. So Charles Lucky Luciano was born in Sicily, Italy on November 24th, 1897. His birth name was actually Salvatore Luciana, but he changed it when he came to the United States. It's kind of up for debate whether he changed it when he came to the United States or it was changed because of errors in the newspaper. There's really no way to know. We just know that it was changed. He was a gangster during the time of Prohibition, which is when the sale and consumption of alcohol was illegal. So it opened a whole new market for illegal bootleggers to profit on the black market sales of alcohol. His family moved from Sicily to the Lower East Side of New York when he was 8 years old. He joined the 5 Points gang in Manhattan at a young age, and by the time he hit his mid-20s, he was making millions of dollars a year in bootlegging profits. He would go on to be the founder of what would one day become known as the Genovese family. He established the commission where the leaders of each of the 5 families would meet to discuss problems and establish business relationships within the families, making the 5 families of New York one big syndicate rather than 5 individual factions. And he had a hand in even separating the families into families before they had been one big organization. So he had a pretty big part to play in the separation of the families. He would be recruited for help by the government during World War II by the same man who put him in jail. This guy is so interesting. Salvatore Luciano was born to Antonio and Rosalia Quania. Antonio was a sulfur pit worker, and his mother was a stay-at-home mother. When he was 8 years old, Salvatore's parents brought him and his 3 siblings to America in search of a better life. They settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a popular place for immigrating Italians to settle, and this would become known today as Little Italy in Manhattan. In 1906, when he was only 10 years old, he had already been involved in a mugging, in shoplifting, and extortion. So this boy started young. Luciano was arrested at 10 years old for shoplifting. His parents were pretty mortified, but he didn't really care at all. He was attending public school 19 in Manhattan and finished grade 6 before dropping out at the age of 14 years old. As soon as he dropped out, he got a job selling hats, but he left that job when he won over $200 playing dice on the streets, and he used the money that he made playing dice to roll him into a criminal career, and he started committing criminal acts. His parents sent him to Brooklyn Truant School that year. I can't really tell anything about his time at Brooklyn Truant School or when he exited that school, but that's the time that he was enrolled there. I don't think he did much time there. I know he didn't graduate. In 1916, he served his first jail sentence, doing 6 months in jail for dealing heroin. He started his own street gang in the early 1910s. The street gang protected Jewish kids in the neighborhood from Italian and Irish gangs for 10 cents a week. At the time, there were other gangs, but they were doing more of the gambling, racketeering, robbing stores, all of that. So he came along with this gang and he protected the Jewish kids who were typically getting picked on by the Italian and Irish gangs. And that was one of the things that they did to profit, was pick on the Jewish kids. So he kind of innovated the game when he came in and said, no, I'm going to protect these kids. But, he made the Jewish kids pay, and he would force them to pay for his protection. So I'm not acting like he was like an angel. In this street gang, he would meet one of his lifelong friends, Meyer Lansky. His gang tried to scare Meyer into paying for their protection, and Meyer laughed at them. He really enjoyed the fact that Meyer laughed at him. Typically, the Jewish kids around the neighborhood were weak and easily manipulated. So the fact that Meyer Lansky, fought back, he really admired this. And he would go on to be friends with this boy, and they would have a lifelong friendship. Until the day that Luciano died, he was friends with Meyer Lansky. On January 17th, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect and Prohibition started, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages prohibited. Criminals saw this as a huge opportunity to start a black market trade around alcohol sales. Underground bars would pop up all over the place, and the people who sold alcohol to these establishments, as well as to individuals, they were known as bootleggers. And this was a huge market. Because just because alcohol became illegal didn't mean that people didn't still want to drink. It's like any other drug, except the only difference is alcohol was legal, and they made it illegal. So people knew the effects that alcohol had, and they wanted it. They wanted to seek it out. So there was a black market trade that, just like any other drug, would bring customers. Especially given the social element of alcohol, a lot of times people drink in a social environment. It loosens them up. So it wasn't just selling on some corner to some shady drug addict. It was selling to pop-up bars and people that were mingling with each other. So it was a whole different ballgame than selling heroin or crack or anything like that. So while World War I was raging, Luciano was learning the tricks of the trade in prostitution pimping, in bootlegging, and everything else criminal. In 1920, Joe Massaria, a gang boss in Lower Manhattan, who was kind of in charge of all illegal activities in New York, and eventually he would become in charge of all illegal activities and the mafia within America. So he hired Luciano as one of his gunmen. He was in the 5 Points gang by this point, and he had formed a close relationship with fellow members like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. The three started working for Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who was a wealthy gambler, and he financed the bootleg operation that the three of them operated. Rothstein was a Jewish mob kingpin, and he had pretty deep roots in corruption. He had a lot to do with corruption in professional athletics. He was the one who conspired to fix the 1919 World Series, which, if you watched my last episode, when Gotti was mad that they were excusing a juror, he was referencing this. He was referencing the fixing of the 1919 World Series. And Arnold Rothstein is actually the one that did that. He's known for turning the underground scene of criminals around from a bunch of street gangsters to an actual empire. He had them trading dice playing and robbing stores to expensive suits and talks over golf, the way that the white-collar industry worked. Rothstein mentored Luciano on many things. One of the most important things that he did teach Luciano was how to move around in high society. So up until this point, Luciano was playing dice, he was shoplifting, he was beating up Jewish kids to make them pay for his protection. And now Rothstein comes along and he introduces him to a life of luxury. He elevated him from a street gangster playing dice on the corner to somebody bootlegging alcohol to high society members. So Arnold Rothstein really is responsible for a huge part of developing Luciano as the person that he would turn into one day. This did come with its own difficulties, though. His public image within his high-class friends was seriously damaged when he was arrested for selling heroin in 1923. He didn't get any jail time, but now everybody that he was hanging around in the high society was viewing him as a drug dealer. And that's a serious step down from the high society associates he's mingling with. Being viewed as a drug dealer seriously degrades your image with the wealthy associates that he had been doing business with up until this point. But he was no fool, and he knew that he had to fix it, and he knew he had to do something big. So a big boxing match was coming up between Jack Dempsey and Louis Firpo in the Bronx. And he saw this as an opportunity. He was making a lot of money at the time, so the huge amount of money that he was about to spend wasn't so much when it was compared to the great loss in income that he would see if the high society members that he had been mingling with started looking down on him. So he purchased 200 tickets to the fight, and he handed them out to the top gangsters and politicians in New York. Continuing his mentorship, Rothstein brought Luciano on a shopping spree. He brought him to Wanamaker's department store in Manhattan to buy expensive clothes to impress the uber-rich group of people that he was gonna be mingling with at this boxing match. The scheme seemed to be successful, and Luciano continued to grow his empire. By 1925, he had an annual income of $4 million a year, which in 1925 was a lot of money. Around today's standards, it would be around $61 million. So that was a yearly income for him. At this time, he was working for both Rothstein and Massaria. He quickly rose through the ranks for Massaria and became a top aide in his criminal organization, which was really the mafia. Rothstein participated in a 3-day-long high-stakes poker game, and he ended up owing $320,000 from this poker game. He claimed that the game was fixed, and he was saying he's not going to pay because it was a fixed game and there was no other way for it to go. He was going to lose. So on November 4th, 1928, during a business meeting at Manhattan's Central Park Hotel, George Hump McManus shot Rothstein. He was rushed to the hospital, but he succumbed to his injuries 3 days later, and he died on November 7th, 1928. After Rothstein died, Luciano started working full-time for Massaria. On October 16th, 1929, Luciano was at a local dock in New York inspecting a load of heroin that was being smuggled into Manhattan on the Hudson River. This was something that was pretty typical, run-of-the-mill operations. It was nothing crazy. He was jumped by 3 men at gunpoint and shoved into a limo. He was handcuffed with his mouth taped shut, and he was driven to Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, he was strung up by his arms above his head to a support beam in the ceiling while he was beaten with fists, blackjacks, and pistol butts until he was unconscious. Finishing him off, one assailant used a long-bladed knife to slash his cheek, ear, and throat, while another stabbed him in the back 12 times with an ice pick. Which, if you know what an ice pick is, I'd way rather get stabbed by a knife than an ice pick. That's some serious stuff right there. Obviously, with his throat slit and having been stabbed 12 times, the assailants assumed he was dead. They threw him in the trunk of the car and drove him to Huguenot Beach in Staten Island to dump his body. The throat slash just missed his jugular vein, and none of the ice pick stabs hit any vital organs. This absolute monster of a man gets up, gets himself together, and aimlessly walks down a deserted road until a cop named Blank found him, at which time he collapsed and fell unconscious. I feel like that's a little Hollywood, walking until, someone finds you and then miraculously you're unconscious. But let's be real, he got stabbed 12 times and he had his throat slit, and anybody is gonna just do what you gotta do to survive until you find someone and then just knock out. But this guy is insane. Can you imagine getting stabbed 12 times, having your throat slit, having your body dumped on a beach, and then getting up and walking until you find a cop? Like, come on. While he was in the hospital recuperating, New York detectives used this time to harass him for hours about the identity of his would-be killers, but let's be honest, anybody that knows anything about the mafia knows that they have one rule that's higher than others: omerta, which is never snitch. Always silence, never snitch. I don't know anything. So he tells them he doesn't know anything and he doesn't understand why anybody wouldn't like him. So throughout the years, many theories have surfaced as far as who actually grabbed him, who the 3 assailants were, and this is including Luciano. So at one point, he says that it was the police that kidnapped him. He says that they kidnapped him because they were looking for someone and they were trying to get it out of him. Either way, the identities of the assailants has never been actually confirmed. Luciano had scars for the rest of his life from this attack. He had a scar on his cheek and his throat, and he had a lazy eye that he got from having his cheekbone broken so severely, so it would change the way his face looked forever. This is how he earned his nickname Lucky Luciano, because not only had he been arrested so many times, up until this point he had been arrested, I think 25 times, and he had never actually done any jail time at this point, but he survived this attack, which is just crazy to hear about, crazy to think about. I can't imagine. Hearing this, I would call him lucky too. So Joe Massaria, the guy that he's been working for, was a self-proclaimed boss of all bosses. He was running the criminal operations in the United States, which was actually the mafia, just wasn't called the mafia yet. A man named Don Vito Ferro, a powerful Sicilian mafioso from Castellammarese del Golfo, wanted control of the mafia operations in the United States, so he sends one of his soldiers, Salvatore Maranzano, to the United States to seize control. Now, obviously, the first place that Maranzano heads is to New York, given that that's where Massaria's operation is based, and given that that's where a majority of the criminal enterprise is based out of. You have some outfits in Chicago, some in Miami, some in California, but the big group of people is going to be in New York. But Don Vito Ferro was thrown in jail pretty quickly after Maranzano arrived in the United States. So just because this happens, that doesn't stop Maranzano. He just takes Ferro's plan and begins to enact it himself. He says, okay, well, he's gone. I'm just going to go ahead and do it for myself. It was genius, and if he can't take the money, I will. One of Messaria's lieutenants, Gaetano Reina, left Messaria's operation and went to work for Maranzano. So at this point, Maranzano had set up his own enterprise, and Reina switches sides and starts working for Maranzano. This obviously angers Messaria, and Messaria sends Luciano to have Reina killed for the crime of switching sides. Reina was killed on February 26, 1930. This murder would be the match that ignited the flame of the Castellammarese War. The Castellammarese War raged from February 1930 to April 1931, and it was mainly based in New York. The war was actually on two different levels. So on the base surface, it is Messaria versus Maranzano, but it would actually be the group of younger mobsters versus the group of older mobsters. We'll get more into that. But on Messaria's side, he has some big hitters. He has Lucky Luciano, Albert Mad Hatter Anastasia, Vito Genovese, Alfred Mineo, Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, and Frank Costello. Now, they faced off against Maranzano's side, which had some pretty big hitters himself. He was working with Joseph Joey Bananas Bonanno, Stefano the Undertaker Magazzino, Joseph Profassi, and Joe Aiello, among others. By the end of the war, over 60 mafia figures would be murdered on the streets of New York. So I said it was on two levels. So on one level, it's Messaria versus Maranzano. But on the other side, it's going to be Maranzano and Messaria. They're bitter enemies, but they're part of a group known as the Mustache Pete's. So the Mustache Pete's are old world gangsters that follow the strict rules of the Sicilian Mafia, and they didn't trust anybody that wasn't Italian, that wasn't Sicilian, and anybody that wasn't Sicilian was not somebody that could be trusted, and they adhered to strict guidelines. And they didn't deal drugs. They didn't do a lot of the things that the younger generation had started doing. The younger generation of gangsters that were coming up, such as Luciano, Genovese, and Costello, they didn't believe in these traditions. They loved working with people of other ethnicities, of other races. They enjoyed the benefits that came from working with the Jewish and Irish gangsters. They made a lot of profit. The Mustache Pete's even had issue with Luciano's longtime friend, Frank Costello, because he wasn't from Sicily. He wasn't Italian enough. He was from Italy, but because he wasn't from Sicily, which is the very south of Italy, it meant he wasn't trustworthy. The younger generation of mobsters started teaming up. The younger generation are the men by Italian heritage. All of them were 100% Italian, but they were born or they grew up in the United States. Being born or growing up in the United States, they're going to have an appreciation for other ethnicities. They didn't grow up just among Italians. They grew up around these Irish, Jewish, other ethnicities, and they liked working with them. They had friends that were other ethnicities. The younger generation was only motivated by profit. They didn't see any benefit in annexing the other gangs in New York just because they didn't hail from the same part of the world as their forefathers, especially while the gangs of the other ethnicities were profiting a lot more than the Italians at the time. The new team of mobsters led by Luciano would come to be known as the Young Turks. Members of the Young Turks included Luciano, Costello, Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Joe Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profassi, Tommy Gagliano, and Tommy Lucchese. Luciano's wish was to make a criminal syndicate, a group where mobsters and gangsters from every background could pool their resources and profit on crimes. He dreamed of a government-like structure where gangsters of all levels could assist each other and could accomplish any mission that would net them profit. In the beginning of 1913, it started to become clear that Messaria was losing the Castellammarese War. His side had suffered a lot more losses, and even the members of his organization started to question his ability to lead in modern times because he was so strictly adherent to the old world traditions. The Young Turks, they just wanted to end this war. There was a lot of conflict and bloodshed, and they viewed this all as unnecessary. They viewed it as costing valuable time, valuable profits, and valuable personnel. So they come along with these ideas of modernizing the mob. Their ideas and what they were putting forth led to a much wider net being cast as far as the followers that they were getting. A lot of gangsters had not conformed to the mafia in the past because of Massaria's rules and because they didn't want to adhere to these rules. So they started to follow Luciano. And with them following Luciano, it led to a lot of mobsters switching sides between the Maranzano-Massaria factions. They would all come together, this whole generation, and they would unite under the Young Turks umbrella. And this is regardless of which Massaria-Maranzano faction they fell under. And because of these progressive thoughts and actions that they had preached and said that they wanted to put in place, there was a much larger number of recruits to fight on their behalf. Gaetano Reina, the soldier that had switched sides and was murdered, he belonged to a much larger family. And once he was murdered, the whole family switched sides. This family switching sides, as well as a lot of the other gangs defecting to Maranzano's side, because Maranzano, while he was a mustache Pete, he was a bit more progressive than Massaria. Massaria was very stuck in old world ways. And Maranzano was as well, but he was a bit more progressive, so a lot of people started going over to his side of things. And while they're doing this, it's turning the tides. And the two biggest people in Massaria's gang, Luciano and Genovese, they begin communications with Maranzano himself. So a deal is struck between Luciano, Genovese, and Maranzano, where Luciano and Genovese would betray Massaria and they would end the war. And once they do that, Luciano would become Maranzano's second in command. On April 15th, 1931, Massaria was killed at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a restaurant in Coney Island, Brooklyn. Anastasia, Genovese, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel were the shooters. Cairo Terranova was the getaway driver, but his anxiety got the better of him. He started freaking out. He was like, oh my God, this is too much. And he had to be forcefully removed from the driver's seat. So Bugsy Siegel forcefully removes him because he doesn't want to get stuck there. So because they were able to get away, nobody was ever actually charged with the murder. So as I was saying before, Maranzano was a bit more progressive thinking, and that is what made Luciano and Genovese work with him. They betrayed Massaria because Maranzano was a bit more forward thinking, and even this is kind of surprising because Maranzano actually came from Sicily. He was sent to America to take over the trade, but he was sent from Sicily. He was a member of the Sicilian Mafia. So the fact that Massaria, who was based in the United States, was so much more strictly adherent to the Sicilian traditions is kind of weird when you think about it. Maybe it wasn't even the Sicilian traditions that they were following, but it didn't take long for Maranzano to piss off the Young Turks. It doesn't take much. So Luciano starts feeling like Maranzano was even more greedy, even more manipulative than Massaria, and he was kind of crazy. Let's be real, he was mentally unstable. So he had created a kill list, and this kill list includes every major mafioso on it, including Luciano. So he finds out about this, and he's like, oh, hell no. With all of this going on September 10th, 1931, a team of Jewish triggermen recruited by Meyer Lansky and including Samuel Levine, Bo Weinberg, and Bugsy Siegel shot and stabbed Maranzano to death in his Manhattan office. So now that both Massaria and Maranzano are dead, there's no official party to control the mafia, and the Young Turks step in. They assumed control and restructured the American mafia. The restructuring would turn the mafia into a corporation-like organization. And instead of the old way of one man being in control of the entire organization, it was broken down into a committee. Maranzano had actually already been in the process of setting up the organization and splitting it up into 5 factions. So right now, the mafia is just the mafia. Everyone in America falls under the mafia. And Maranzano's idea is to split it up into 5 factions. So when Luciano takes over, because the Young Turks take over and Luciano is leading the Young Turks. So when Luciano takes over, He continues this plan and he creates the National Crime Commission, which would evolve into the 5 families of New York that we know today. So this is also where the entire structure of the mafia came from. So the idea of having a boss, an underboss, the capos, the soldiers, the associates, this all comes from this time. Even though Maranzano has all of these ideas, he wants to split it up, he wants to have a boss of each of the 5 factions, he still wants to be the capo di tu capi, or the boss of bosses. I apologize if I pronounced that crazy. He wants to act as the dictator of the American mafia. So pretty much he wants to be the president while the 5 families each have their own boss and those bosses would report to him. So Maranzano makes it clear that he's not banning business relationships with non-Italians. Even though he actually hails from Italy, he doesn't want to ban business relationships with non-Italians. But they can only raise to the rank of associate. They can never actually be a part of the organization. They can never fall into the boss, the underboss, the capos, none of that. They can only be an associate. This is where the idea of being a made member comes from. So only fully Italian people can become made men. Anyone else can work with the mafia, but they can't become made men, which means they can't step into any official roles within the mafia. So this is also where the name the Cosa Nostra came from. And that's what he planned to name the group of 5 families or 5 factions. So it's a bit unclear. So up until now, they're saying that the mafia was pretty much just one big organization. But we see that when Reina died, he had a whole family. And that large family switched sides. And that had a pretty big turn in the war, the Castellammarese War. So there was some kind of family structure already in place. This wasn't a completely new idea, but I think that maybe there was a lot of little families. And his idea was to just get 5 large groups of people. So Maranzano's idea that he wants to lay out is that the leaders of the families would be Luciano, Profassi, Gagliano, Vincent Mangano, and himself. He has a meeting at Wappingers Falls, New York, and this is his plan that he lays out. After Maranzano died, Luciano lays out his plans to the members, and he wants to create a commission, which is a group. It's a meeting of the bosses of each of the families, and this is where they can work out any issues. They can keep unnecessary bloodshed from happening, and they can work as a group. This keeps everybody on his side because a lot of people were pretty loyal to Maranzano. So when he says that he doesn't want to be the boss of bosses, this keeps everybody on his side because it's clear that he didn't just come in and kill Maranzano so that he could take the position of boss of bosses. He didn't want the position of boss of bosses because he felt like it would make him a target, and anybody that wanted to raise to that position would come and kill him, which, let's be real, it's probably true. It's probably how he lasted that long, was that he never took that position. So now at this point, Massaria is dead and Maranzano is killed. And the night that Maranzano is killed, there's a purge of the Mustache Pete's. This is a night that would come to be known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Historically, the Night of the Sicilian Vespers was actually a thing that had taken place one night in Italy. They orchestrate this attack for 2 reasons. The first reason was that they didn't want the older generation to come in and come after them for the murders of Massaria and Maranzano. The second reason is that they wanted to get rid of the old world thinking completely and start out fresh and new and build the mafia with their vision and not have to answer to the old timers that had more time in the mafia and would fight them every step of the way. The Night of the Sicilian Vespers is actually a term that was borrowed from an event that happened in 1282. In 1282, in Sicily, there was a Frenchman, and he was having an affair with a Sicilian's wife. And the Sicilian came out and killed the Frenchman, and after this happened, for some reason there was a lot of French people in Sicily at the time. I'm not really sure why, but at the time it seems like maybe something had happened in France and they had been placed in Sicily for a reason. This man having an affair with a Sicilian's wife made every Sicilian in Sicily mad, and they start killing these poor Frenchmen. Now, remember that this isn't modern day. A lot of this stuff is in the early 1900s. The records that they kept wasn't exactly trustworthy. Most of what happened on the night of Maranzano's murder or the night of the Sicilian Vespers is a myth. So if you watch a Hollywood movie, you're gonna see, 100 people being murdered in various various ways across America. That's not really what happened. An organized crime expert actually went through the records and didn't find that large of a number of people that were killed. And even the people that were killed, it was kind of unsubstantiated. They weren't able to tell if it was because of the night of the Sicilian Vespers or just another Italian mafia guy that got killed. Most of the killings were lieutenants of Maranzano. The actual numbers weren't as high as the movies portrayed. Plus, Luciano wasn't the type that would just go murdering people. He didn't kill people for fun. Luciano was very methodical, and if he killed someone, there was a reason for it. In 1963, there was a book written about Joe Valachi. He testified in 1963, and he didn't testify about this. He didn't testify about the night of the Sicilian Vespers. But Peter Moss writes this book. He says some of what's written in the book is just from speaking with Valachi. The book is called The Valachi Papers, if you ever want to check it out. So in this book, Valachi claims that the night of Maranzano's murder, or the night of the Sicilian Vespers, was part of an intricate, painstakingly executed mass extermination engineered by Charles Lucky Luciano, where 40 Cosa Nostra leaders allied with Maranzano were slain all across the country. Now, I think 40 is more along the lines of what actually happened. You know, they claim in Hollywood that it was 100. I think it's more along the lines of, 35 to 45 people. So now the mafia has been split up into the 5 factions. They turn into families. And Luciano's family controls a lot of criminal rackets. This is including illegal gambling, extortion, bookmaking, loan sharking, drug trafficking, everything you attribute to the mafia. Nowadays, this is what Luciano's family is in charge of. He's also the first mafioso to get involved in legitimate industries. He became a pretty large presence in the labor unions, and he controlled Manhattan's waterfront. He controlled garbage hauling, construction, garment district business, and trucking. And this is stuff you'll see a lot in the newer generation of the mafia. All of the big bosses, they all had the same kind of stuff where the control over industries such as garbage hauling, garment districts, all that stuff. So this is where it all comes from. It's when Luciano comes in and he says, we need to make a bigger profit, and the way that we're going to do that is to get into legitimate activities, and we're going to take a piece of it. So even though Luciano did throw away Maranzano's idea of having a capo di 2 capi, he did hold on to the structure that Maranzano had built. The 5 families stayed in place. This was something that Maranzano had planned. The rank structure carried through to the families, and he enforced the idea that while gangsters of other races can be associates, they can't be part of the actual organization. So he's actually the one that puts into place the ability to become a made man, fully Sicilian at the time. It would eventually evolve into any part of Italy. In the Luciano family, Lucky was the boss, his underboss was Genovese, and Castello was the consigliere. Adonis, Michael, Trigger Mike Coppola, Anthony Strollo, Willie Moretti, and Anthony Carfano were all capos. Now, Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky were top associates to the family, but they didn't come from Italian descent. They were Jewish, so they were top associates, but they weren't actually a part of the mafia. Now, this is the point where he's going to establish the commission. The commission is the group of the top-ranking officials in each family, and they would have meetings, discuss business, work out any issues that presented themselves. And the commission's going to be made up of representatives from each of the 5 families in New York. The Buffalo family, the Chicago, they were all represented. And later on, the Philadelphia and Detroit chapters are going to be added to the commission as well. And other smaller families around the country, they'd be formally represented by a commission family. The commission is also where you would go to distinguish boundaries. For instance, this is how the 5 families got separated into the 5 boroughs of New York. So we have a Staten Island group, we have a Manhattan group, a Long Island group, a Brooklyn group, and a Queens group. And each of the 5 families would have their own boundaries and would stay within that area. Gay Orlova, born Galina Orlova, was born of Russian-French heritage in Petrograd, Russia. Her mother, Antonia, fled the Bolsheviks when she was a toddler. She settled in Constantinople, Turkey, and this is where Gay Orlova began to dance. When she was 16 years old, she left Turkey. She boarded the SS Senia and landed in Rhode Island in the United States. She quickly made her way to New York. She met Earl Carroll, a Broadway producer. She had a 6-month visa to remain in the United States, but she quickly married a man named Ed Finn. He was an usher at the theater that she was working at. So although the marriage only lasted 48 hours before being annulled, now she was allowed to stay within the United States. Again, this is earlier times. Nowadays, you can't do that. They come and they'll interview your family. They'll ask you what kind of toothpaste your lover uses. You have to be married for a certain amount of time to gain citizenship, but back then, all you need to have was to have been married in the first place, and now you have all access granted to stay within the United States. So she is a dancer. She gets to be known on Broadway as Gay All Over. At the end of 1934, she traveled to Palm Island, Florida, to perform in Carol's show that had recently opened up there, and this is where she meets Charles Luciano. When spring came, Luciano left Florida. He had to go back to New York, but she was still there performing in Carol's show. She left Florida for New York and was reunited with him in New York City. They had formed a relationship and continued to build it until 1935, when Lucky left Manhattan when Arthur Dutch Schultz Schlegenheimer was murdered. She cried to reporters that she hadn't seen him in weeks, and she said that she had no idea why the public was saying the things about him that they were saying, and that he was such a dear. With Luciano gone, Gay didn't want to stay in New York, so she traveled back to Florida, and she had no idea that that's actually where Luciano was. She was ecstatic to find him, and they picked up right where they had left off in New York. In the early 1930s, the Luciano family started to venture into a new industry, prostitution. In June of 1935, Herbert H. Lehman, governor of New York, appointed Thomas Dewey, along with his ADA Eunice Carter, she's female type, as a special prosecutor to combat organized crime in New York City. I feel like every generation has that, special prosecutor for organized crime. At this time, it was Thomas Dewey. So after some investigation and following the money, Carter discovered that Luciano was connected to this whole prostitution racket and that he was connected to the underworld. He was involved in organized crime. So it didn't take her long to get to Luciano's name. She led a raid of 200 brothels in Manhattan and Brooklyn. She arrested 100 women and 10 men. And usually at this time, when prostitutes and madams were arrested, they were just released. But with this group that had been arrested, these women were held and they were brought to court, and they were each given a $10,000 bail, which none of them could afford to pay. So with the bail set so high, Carter went around and convinced multiple women to testify against Luciano to avoid a heftier jail sentence. He was implicated by many women as being involved in the racket and was implicated by 3 as being the ringleader. He was made aware that he was going to be arrested for his involvement with the prostitution ring, so he left. He skedaddled down to Hot Springs, Arkansas. In some horrible turn of events, there was a detective that was actually in Hot Springs, Arkansas, working on a completely different case, following a completely different person, but he saw him. He let Dewey know that this is where Luciano was. On April 3rd, 1936, Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs on a criminal warrant from New York. Luciano and his accomplices were indicted on 60 counts of compulsory prostitution. His lawyers fought to prevent him from being extradited to New York. However, on April 16th, he was transported back for trial, where he was held without bail. During the trial, Dewey led the prosecution, in which he accused Luciano of being involved in a massive prostitution ring, which was now being known as the Combination. He pointed out that his taxes claimed an income of only $22,000 a year, but clearly he was a very, very wealthy man. He wasn't making no $22,000 a year. I feel like even $22,000 a year, that's a pretty decent income at the time, but not the excessive wealth that Luciano clearly had. And he would question his relationships with all the mafia associates that were well known in the mafia, and pretty much question, hey, why do you know this person? Why are you pictured with this person? On June 7th, he was convicted of 62 counts of compulsory prostitution, and on June 18th, he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. So nowadays, when crime experts and historians look back at the trial, they say that the evidence against him was actually really, really thin. Luciano more than likely wasn't even involved in the prostitution racket at all. He was probably just the boss, and he was having profits kicked up to him. which is a crime itself nowadays after Giuliani came along, and he put together the group of laws which would come to charge people with RICO. Now, if Luciano was operating in today's day and age, he would be charged with the RICO, and he would have been found guilty the way that things actually had gone. But back then, RICO was not a law. So now that Luciano is arrested, Gay is seen all over the papers because remember, Gay's a pretty well-known person. She's all over Broadway. She's pretty famous herself. So she's seen in the papers saying, I don't believe any of those charges, especially that one about compulsory something or other. It just doesn't sound nice. Not like lucky at all. Compulsory something or other was the prize euphemism for prostitution. Gay held a press conference and she let her objections be known. She said that Charlie was just like any other fellow. He was nice, she said. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison and Gay split. She left for Paris. When Hitler and Stalin signed the Brotherhood Pact in 1939, Gay was arrested as a possible Russian spy, but she wasn't really held long. When Hitler's army took over France in 1941, she was picked up by the Nazis, but she escaped detention again. Luciano remained the boss of his family with Genovese as the acting boss while he was in prison, but when Genovese left the country for Naples to avoid a murder indictment, his consigliere Castello was appointed as the acting boss. So he started off his jail sentence at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossing, New York, but later that year he was moved to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, which was much further away from New York City. So it made it a lot harder for him to lead the family. Even though Clinton was a lot further away from his family and his associates, he did live the high life at this prison. So Luciano is living the life that, before the days of Gotti, most people's idea of a mafioso doing jail time is, you know, in their cell getting exquisite meals delivered to them on the tennis court. That's the kind of life that he's living at Clinton. Then the days of, you know, the modern mafia come along and Gotti is put in solitary for his entire life and they tortured that poor man. But during these days, this is when that stuff isn't going on. They're living the high life back then. He had specially made meals delivered to him, and he had a church built for him in the prison. And at the time, it was one of the only prisons in the country that had a church at all. So his influence in this prison was clearly pretty substantial. So he continues leading his family, and he continues the appeals process. But in 1938, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to review his case. And once this happened, he gave up on the appeals process and stepped down as the family boss, and Castello formally replaced him. In 1942, tensions were at an all-time high with World War II. America didn't join World War II until December 7th, 1941. So 1942, things are starting to ramp up. The Office of the Naval Intelligence, they're worried about a lot of stuff being out of their control. They're worried that agents of the Axis forces were able to enter the United States through the New York waterfront. They were worried about sabotage in these facilities. They're worried about interruption in activities due to the war efforts. So they're kind of freaking out. Dewey, the man that prosecuted the case of Luciano, he knows how to help. Dewey is now the governor of New York, and he proposes a mutually beneficial relationship with Luciano, who he knew would be able to help. So they struck a deal where Luciano's sentence would be commuted if he helped. It actually made Luciano a pretty big influence on World War II, which is surprising because Luciano comes from Italy. He was literally born there. Italy at the time is part of the Axis powers. With Luciano helping America, he's going against his home country. The collaboration between the Navy and the Mafia was known as Operation Underworld. So now that this is going on, he's transferred to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock, New York, which is much closer to New York City. And it makes it easier for him to issue orders to his family. It makes it easier for him to communicate with the naval intelligence that's coming for help. It was just necessary for him to move. So he moves to Great Meadow Correctional Facility. Luciano promised complete assistance of the Mafia. He promised that they would provide intelligence to the Navy, and Anastasia actually promised that there would be no dock worker strikes during the war. So Anastasia has Luciano's back. He provided the U.S. military with Sicilian Mafia contacts before the Allied invasion of Sicily, so they could let the mafia know, hey, we're coming in. I don't know the communications that went on between the Navy and the Sicilian mafia. All I know is that he gave up contacts. A ship was sunk in the New York harbor, the SS Normandy, which was directed by Anastasia's brother, Anthony Anastasio. Even though an official investigation concluded that there was no foul play in the ship sinking, I feel like it's possible that they just didn't want to give credit where credit was due. When it came out to the public that they were working with criminals, they probably wanted to deny their impact as much as they could. So they said, oh, no foul play. There was foul play. On January 3rd, 1946, Luciano's sentence was commuted by Dewey on the condition that he was immediately deported to Italy. They did not want him here in America anymore. On February 9th, 1946, the night before his departure from the United States, Luciano shared a spaghetti dinner with Anastasia and 5 other guests as a farewell. It was clearly ripping Luciano apart that he had to leave. He had been in the United States since he was 9 years old. Can you imagine having to leave the country that you have been in since you were 9 years old? I know a lot of people nowadays are experiencing stuff that's a lot similar to this, and I just couldn't imagine that kind of pain and loss. So I can only imagine his pain on the night that he is sitting down with the brothers that he's had for his entire life and pretty much saying goodbye to them, saying goodbye to the country that is the only place that he knows. Now, he is luckier than a lot of other deportees because he's a millionaire. He's very well off, so he won't have any issues. Once he gets to Italy, he's gonna be fine. A lot of people don't have that benefit. They're sent to a foreign country that they've never been to with next to nothing, which is 10 times worse. But this is what's going on with him. He's getting deported. It's sad. It's hard for him to go through. The trip to Italy took him 17 days by boat, and when he arrived, there was reporters there waiting for him, and he told the media that he would probably be residing in Sicily. When Luciano was released from prison only 9.5 years after his sentencing of 30 to 50 years and deported to Italy, Gay was overjoyed. She had left for Paris, remember? So after he had been in Italy for only 3 months, she sought permission to cross the Alps to get to him, but her request was refused. In October of 1946, Luciano secretly moved to Havana, Cuba to be closer to the United States so that he could stay involved with the American Mafia operations and eventually return home. This man would fight for the rest of his life to return to the United States. So it's really sad to see these attempts that he makes to stay within the United States, stay involved in his family, stay involved with everything that could lead to him eventually returning home. So that's pretty much what he does. He moves to Havana, Cuba, and starts to plan his return. So Cuba's a lot closer to the United States than Italy is, and Lansky also already has established connections in Cuba. And he also has the ability to congregate people that he knows and associates to meet with Luciano there. So in 1946, Lansky does just that. He calls a meeting of the commission in Havana that December, which would come to be known as the Havana Conference. The people that went said that they were going to see Frank Sinatra perform, but it was really a commission meeting that Luciano would be able to attend. They were discussing 3 topics: the heroin trade, the Cuban gambling, and a hotel of Bugsy Siegel's that was failing. So remember that Bugsy Siegel is a top associate of the mafia, and whether or not Luciano is there, Bugsy Siegel had a lot of profit that he was giving to the mafia. So if he had a hotel that was failing, that was something that warranted discussion by the commission. Earlier that year, Genovese had returned to the United States. He stood trial for the murder charge that he was fleeing from, and the case was dismissed. So he was able to stay in New York, and he attended the Havana Conference. Now, Genovese spent a pretty good chunk of this time trying to convince Luciano to take on the role of capo di tutti and let him run the show while he was in Cuba, and Luciano didn't trust him. So Luciano is quoted as saying, "There is no boss of bosses. I turned it down in front of everybody. If I ever change my mind, I will take the title, but it won't be up to you. Right now, you work for me, and I ain't in the mood to retire. Don't you ever let me hear this again, or I'll lose my temper." Luciano was no joke. It doesn't sound like he was mean. It just sounds like he got aggravated. He was probably, Genovese was in his ear, just being annoying. Come on, be the boss of bosses and let me do it. So, he kind of brushed him off. Luciano wasn't really secretive about being in Cuba. He was secretive about his trip to Cuba, but once he was there, he wasn't secretive about being there. He was publicly hanging out with Sinatra. He was visiting a lot of nightclubs that the media hung out at. He was going to attractions where he was being photographed, but the US government did eventually get wind that he was in Havana. I'm guessing that this mattered because the commission had gone over there for a meeting, and the US government starts getting intelligence that the commission is meeting in Havana because Luciano is there. So when they find out, they threaten Cuba. They tell Cuba that as long as Luciano's there, the US is not sending any narcotic prescription drugs. So pretty much, you keep Luciano and all of your citizens that are currently on narcotic prescription drugs, they're screwed. 2 days later, the Cuban government detained him and put him on a Turkish freighter back to Italy. As soon as he returned to Italy, he was immediately arrested. He was warned to stay out of trouble and that he would be under strict police scrutiny forever. In Italy, Luciano had a lot of run-ins with the law. In 1949, he was arrested in Rome for his involvement in shipping narcotics to New York. He was released without any charges being filed, but he did spend a week in jail. In 1951, he was brought in on suspicion of smuggling cash and an American car into Italy. Again, he was released without any charges being filed, but he was subjected to 20 hours of interrogation. In 1952, the US and Canadian law enforcement officials, they were complaining. They were complaining that Luciano, because at this point, Luciano is traveling Italy, he's going here and there, and now the US and Canada, they're complaining about Luciano's ability to travel the world. They go to the Italian government, and then the Italian government confiscates his passport. In 1954, he was essentially put under house arrest. He had requirements to report to the police every Sunday. He wasn't allowed to travel outside of Naples without police permission, and he had to adhere to a curfew. They said that this was for his involvement in the narcotics trade, but he wasn't actually ever charged with anything, so they put all these restrictions on him for no reason. But then again, this is Italy. This is the same country that tried Amanda Knox like 3 times for the same murder. Their government doesn't really have any rules to protect citizens. In all of that area, France, England, all of those places, the rules are set up to protect the police. They're set up to put people in jail, not protect people from going to jail. So a lot of Americans, they expect the same protections that they experience in America, but they don't get it. Italy does not care. They don't have any protections for citizens. They'll throw you in jail forever, and they'll do whatever they want. They don't have to charge you with anything to put you on house arrest and put you on restrictions, and they don't have to give you a reason for it. So that's what they did here. So while Luciano was stuck in Italy under police supervision, his frenemy, Genovese, was back in America and he was making moves. In 1957, he and Carlo Gambino, the underboss of the Anastasia family, attacked Frank Castello, who was the acting boss for the Luciano family, and he had taken leadership back of the family when he was released from prison. Genovese ordered Vincent the Chin Gigante to execute Castello. Gigante grabbed Castello as he was exiting his apartment, and he shot him in the head. But he's a really bad shot, apparently. Because at a point-blank range, he barely grazed his head, and Castello lived. Castello obviously adhered to omerta. He didn't cooperate with the police, but since this was such a public attack, police did arrest Gigante and they charged him with attempted murder. He was acquitted and he thanked Castello after the verdict was read. Castello really didn't have any choice at this point. He had to retire and he handed over the reins of leadership to Genovese. And Luciano is stuck in Italy. He can't do anything to stop it, and he's under such close scrutiny with the police. He's under his little house arrest sentence. He can't really do anything. So they're all in kind of crappy positions, and it's all because of Genovese. On October 25th, 1957, Genovese and Gambino arranged the murder of Anastasia. And Anastasia, remember, he's one of Luciano's closest allies. And Anastasia was murdered in his barbershop, which is really sad. Anastasia seems like he was a very good person. So now Anastasia is dead, and Genovese calls a meeting of the commission to be held in Appalachian, New York. He planned this meeting of the commission to get permission to take over the family, but things went really, really bad. The Appalachian meeting was raided by cops, and over 65 high-ranking mobsters were arrested. The Mafia was front page in the newspapers, and they were dragged through the court system, and everybody blamed Genovese for this fiasco. So according to legends, Luciano had a meeting to discuss heroin with somebody in the French Connection, and he paid said unnamed underground associate that was a Puerto Rican drug dealer to falsely implicate Genovese on a drug deal. So on April 4th, 1959, Genovese was convicted on conspiracy to violate federal narcotics laws and sentenced to 15 years behind bars. Ha, ha, ha. So he made an attempt to be the boss of the family from prison in the 10 years before his death, but obviously that's a really hard thing to do. Anyone's gonna have difficulty leading a whole family from prison, but he made his best attempt. And while Genovese went to prison, Carlo Gambino became the most powerful man in the Cosa Nostra. Obviously, he would go on to lead the Gambino family. It would change the whole name of the family, and the Gambino family is the strongest and most lucrative of the 5 families, so Carlo Gambino is the top of the top right now. But I don't really like what happened here. I don't like it. How are you gonna flip on your main man that brought you up in the game like this? Genovese was a member of the Young Turks. They were day ones. And you're just gonna turn around and kill Anastasia? And you're gonna kill him to get to Luciano? The only reason you are anybody is because Luciano put you where you were. And then you turn around and murder people. That's not cool, man. Igia Lissoni was born in Milan, Italy on December 28, 1920. She grew up in a rich family, and her parents, Giovanni Lissoni and Ida Paghi, had noticed that she had a love for dance when she was pretty young and enrolled her in ballet. She met Lucky Luciano when she was dancing at a club in Rome. Lucky would say that the day that he met her was the most important day of his life. He said that it was a love at first sight for him, and he went to the owner and told the owner, hey, I want to meet that girl. The owner brought Igia over to meet Lucky, but she got up and walked away. Lucky got pretty close with the famous singer Loretta Massario, who was married to Johnny Dorelli, who was said to be the Bing Crosby of Italy at the time. Loretta knew Igia, and she brought her to meet him again. They did a little double date. She spoke a little bit, but she really didn't want anything to do with Lucky. Her family was rich. She was from Milan, which apparently at the time, someone from Milan versus someone from Sicily to Italians meant that she was on the top of the skyscraper and he was in the basement. And yeah, that's a direct quote from Lucky. Lucky actually enjoyed the chase. He had a lot of notoriety. The media followed him around, so women threw themselves at him. So this woman coming along, she's beautiful, and she wants nothing to do with him. So he's liking this. She finally gives in, and they begin to date. She moves in with him at the Excelsior Hotel, but she requests that they move and relocate to an apartment in Parioli, Rome. Igia's parents were pissed. They find out that their rich, well-educated, good girl of a daughter is now in a relationship with a notorious mobster, and they're mad. But I think eventually they signed off on the relationship. In 1949, Luciano was arrested and held in Regina Coeli prison in Rome for complicity in the smuggling of narcotics. So this man just stayed involved in drug dealing his entire life. Igia camped outside the prison the entire time he was in jail. She only left to visit public officials asking for his release. So she was a real one. When he was released 9 days later, 9 days of waiting outside that prison. She was waiting outside for him along with a horde of reporters, and the next day the Italian newspapers were filled with photos of the two embracing. They began to travel Italy together. The only problem that they had was that when she would go to see a ballet, he would go to a racetrack or go to the movies. He refused to go to the ballet. He would go to tell media that she would get very angry with me when I told her that I would do anything for her, except see a lot of fairies jump around in tights with their balls showing. At the end of 1957, Igia started to notice that she had pretty persistent fatigue. There were small lumps in her left breast, and they were pretty painful to the touch. She went and saw the doctor, and he recommended exploratory surgery, but she was scared. She didn't want to have the surgery. She was scared about what she was going to look like afterwards. She was scared about the surgery itself. She didn't want to do it, so she didn't have the surgery right away. She insisted on waiting and watching the symptoms. It turned out to be breast cancer, and her left breast was removed. She struggled with recovery. She had to do a lot of adjusting to her new body image, but she finally did it. She finally recovered, and they went on a trip, and during this trip, she discovered more lumps in her right breast, and they had to remove that one as well. But by this time, they informed her there's nothing else they can do. It's progressed too far at this point, and she wasn't going to make it. In September of 1958, she fell into a coma. In the last days of her life, Luciano rarely left her bedside. He sat beside her. He watched her intently for hours. He didn't eat anything. The lines on his face grew deeper. You could just tell he was struggling so much with this. He did not want her to die and did everything he could for her. Not much could be done though, and Igea Lusoni died on September 27th, 1958 at only 37 years old. Nowadays, they would probably say that she had the BRCA gene. That's really young. 37 years old is really young to die of breast cancer. I know it happens all the time. Not every young person that has it dies from that, but it is pretty young. There was probably a reason behind it. So 4 months after Igea passed away, Luciano starts to date Adriana Rizzo. Rizzo was aware that Igea was the love of his life. She was never going to be able to fill that hole, but they got along. Why not? He didn't ever mention Gay again or wanting to reunite with her, and as of 1954, Gay was still present in Paris and attempting to be reunited with Luciano. On January 26, 1962, Luciano had plans to go to the Naples International Airport to meet with an American movie producer, Martin Gosch, and he was going to discuss a movie based on his life. He had spent a long time denying anyone the ability to write this movie. Everybody had been trying, and he kept denying it. But he said now that Igea had passed, he wasn't really too scared about the skeletons in his closet coming out anymore. He didn't want his dirty laundry of his past to come out while Igea was alive, but Igea had passed away. 4 years had gone by, and he finally gave in and met with Martin Gosch at the Naples International Airport. Luciano attended the meeting and everything went great. However, right after the meeting, he started having chest pains. He had a heart attack at Naples International Airport and died right there. Had he not died, he would have been arrested. He didn't know it, but at the time, Italian drug agents had followed him to the airport and they were fully prepared to arrest him on drug smuggling charges. 3 days later, a service was held in Naples in which 300 people attended. His body was led through the streets of Naples in a horse-drawn black hearse. Luciano's relatives fought the United States government and they wanted to bring his body to the United States, and they actually won the fight. His body was flown back to New York for burial, and he was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. While only 300 people showed up for his services in Naples, around 2,000 mourners attended his funeral in Queens. Gambino gave his eulogy. See, that kind of pisses me off, because Gambino, you were playing dirty. You had something to do with betraying him. So I know you were another one of his day ones, but you had something to do with the murder of Anastasia, so jerk. In 1998, Time magazine named Luciano as the criminal mastermind and placed him among the top 20 most influential builders and titans of the 20th century. So I have a theory, and I want to talk about it real quick. So let's go back to Romeo and Juliet. So what happens? Juliet takes this drug that stops her heart, makes it seem like she's dead, and Romeo believes it to the point that he actually ends up committing suicide because he wants to be with her, even though she's still alive. And then she wakes up, she commits suicide, blah, blah, blah. We all know the story. But wouldn't it be brilliant if he did something along those lines and took like a Juliet-type drug to convince the governments that he was dead so that his body could be flown back to the United States and he could finally stop being watched by the cops, and an empty casket was buried in Queens. I looked around and I couldn't find anybody ever thinking about this or proposing it as a possible option. And I'm really surprised to hear that because, I mean, Elvis Presley and Tupac are still alive in a lot of people's minds. You know, they didn't actually die. How do we know Lucky Luciano died? Now, I know I'm one of the biggest conspiracy theorists in the world, but what if he did live? What if he did know that that day the government was there to arrest him? Are you gonna really tell me Lucky Luciano didn't know that the cops were there to arrest him at the airport? What if he made one last act, and it was to give an autobiography account Sagash, and then figured out a way to make it seem like he was dead. This would get both the American and Italian governments off his back. It would get him back into the United States when they moved the body, and he had been trying his entire life to return to the United States, and it would reinforce his nickname Lucky. If he lived through it, he could have lived in the underground, and the rest of the world thought he was dead, but he could just continue operating within the mafia. With the amount of money that he had, I'm sure that there was a way that he could have paid off someone to fake his death, say that they had put formaldehyde in or done something like that, and he could have just lived. I mean, he was young. He was only 64 years old. And we're to believe that the man that survived having his throat slit, being stabbed 12 times, having his body dumped on a beach, he survived all of that, and a heart attack did him in? Really? 2 minutes before he was supposed to be arrested? I think that man lived. I do. I don't think he's still alive now. It was long enough ago. There's no way he's still alive, but I don't think he died when they said he did. Now, the only thing that makes me think that this couldn't be true is that there's been so many rats in the mafia. There's been so many of them that you would think at least once that it would pop up that he's still alive. But what if it did? What if it kept popping up and the government just made sure that it didn't get out? I think I'm onto something here. So if anybody does any kind of research into that and wants to let me know, great, because I don't think Lucky Luciano died of no heart attack in no airport. I'm sorry, I just don't. But anyways, I digress. Countless films, TV series, documentaries, and books have been written about the life and death of Luciano. He had a permanent impact on all facets of the revolution within the United States. He laid the groundwork for an entire criminal organization, and eventually that criminal organization would net billions and billions of dollars in profits. His impact during the war and tying the worlds of industry and criminal organizations together could never be calculated. And there's no doubt that his legend lives on even to this day. The man is a beast, and I really enjoyed looking into him. He had such an interesting life, but I still don't think he died in Naples Airport. So anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for listening. I hope I was able to keep your attention until the very end. I know this is going to be a long video, but I hope you guys have a great week, and thanks so much for tuning in. Bye!